Big Shaq stood in his own bank, denied access to his own funds. What seemed like a simple glitch spiraled into a web of corruption. His name used as a shield for schemes that ran deeper than anyone imagined. 9 minutes later, the game shifted. Now he wasn't just fighting for his money, he was fighting for justice. What's hidden behind the glass walls will shake the entire system. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun cast a golden hue over the city, its rays glinting off the sleek glass facades of towering skyscrapers. Among them stood the headquarters of First Capital Bank, a symbol of financial prowess and modern architecture. The building's mirrored exterior reflected the bustling morning traffic and the clear blue sky, creating a mesmerizing dance of light and movement. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, its polished surface gleaming under the morning sun. The driver stepped out swiftly, opening the rear door with practiced precision. From the vehicle emerged a figure of imposing stature and gentle demeanor. Big Shaq, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that complemented his towering frame, he exuded an air of confidence and approachability. His presence was immediately recognized by passers-by, who greeted him with smiles and nods of respect. Shaq acknowledged them with a warm smile and a nod, his deep voice resonating as he exchanged pleasantries. He was not just a celebrity or a successful businessman, he was a beloved figure in the community, known for his generosity and down-to-earth nature. As he approached the bank's entrance, the glass doors parted smoothly, revealing a spacious lobby bathed in natural light. The interior was a blend of modern design and understated luxury. Marble floors, high ceilings, and minimalist decor that spoke of elegance without ostentation. The security personnel at the entrance straightened up, their expressions shifting from professional detachment to genuine warmth. "Good morning, Mr. O'Neill," one of them greeted. "Morning, fellas," Shaq replied, his voice carrying the ease of familiarity. He paused to exchange a few words, inquiring about their families and sharing a light-hearted joke that elicited chuckles. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was a mix of quiet efficiency and subdued chatter. Customers waited patiently, some engrossed in their phones, others engaged in hushed conversations. The staff moved with practiced grace, attending to clients with courteous professionalism. Shaq made his way to the VIP section, a discreet area designed for high-profile clients. The receptionist, a young woman with a poised demeanor, looked up and offered a courteous smile. "Good morning, Mr. O'Neill. How can we assist you today?" "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Shaq responded, his tone friendly yet businesslike. "Of course. Please have a seat, and I'll inform the manager." As he settled into a plush leather chair, Shaq's gaze wandered across the lobby. He observed the interactions between staff and customers, noting the efficiency and decorum that characterized the establishment. It was a scene he had witnessed countless times, yet today there was an undercurrent of anticipation he couldn't quite place. Moments later, the branch manager, a middle-aged man with a polished appearance, approached. "Mr. O'Neill, good morning. I'm Wade Travers, the branch manager. I understand you'd like to make a withdrawal." "That's right," Shaq confirmed, extending a hand. Travers shook it with a firm grip, his smile professional. "May I ask the amount you'd like to withdraw?" Shaq mentioned the sum, a figure well within the limits of his account. Travers's smile faltered slightly. "I see. Let me just check the system to ensure everything is in order." He retreated to his office, leaving Shaq with a sense of unease. The delay was unusual, especially for a routine transaction. He glanced around, noting the subtle shifts in the staff's demeanor, furtive glances, hushed whispers. Something was amiss. After several minutes, Travers returned, his expression apologetic. "Mr. O'Neill, I regret to inform you that there appears to be a temporary issue with our system. I'm unable to process your withdrawal at this time." Shaq's brow furrowed. "Is there a problem with my account?" "No, your account is in good standing. It's just a technical glitch. I assure you we're working to resolve it as quickly as possible." Shaq nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had encountered obstacles before, but this felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, an undercurrent of something unspoken. "All right," he said, rising from his seat. "I'll wait." Travers hesitated. "It might take some time. Perhaps you'd prefer to come back later." Shaq met his gaze, the warmth in his eyes replaced by steely resolve. "I'll wait." He returned to his seat, the atmosphere around him thick with unspoken questions. The staff continued their tasks, but their movements were tinged with unease. Shaq sat quietly, his imposing figure a silent testament to patience and determination. As minutes ticked by, the initial warmth of the morning gave way to a growing sense of disquiet. Shaq's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the values instilled in him by his mother, Lucille, and his stepfather, Philip. They had taught him resilience, the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. He recalled his father's words, "Pressure is what you feel when you don't know what's going on. Stay calm, assess the situation, and act accordingly." Drawing strength from those lessons, Shaq remained composed, his demeanor unshaken. He knew that beneath the surface of this seemingly minor inconvenience lay a deeper issue, one that required not just patience but vigilance. The morning sun continued to stream through the bank's windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. In that moment, Shaq understood that this was more than a simple banking error. It was the beginning of a challenge that would test not just his patience, but his principles, and he was ready. The air inside the bank felt denser than before, as though an invisible pressure had descended upon the space. Shaq remained seated, the leather of the chair molding to his form while his gaze scanned the room with a quiet intensity. Every detail, from the subtle shuffle of papers behind the teller counter, to the low hum of muted conversations, carried a faint edge, like static on the edge of a radio signal. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Wade Travers returned, his polished shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. His practiced smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, voice steady yet tinged with a faint unease. "It appears the system issue is more complex than we initially thought. I'm terribly sorry, but at this time we're unable to process your request." Shaq's eyes remained steady on Wade, his large hands resting on his knees. The tension in his jaw was barely perceptible, but it was there. "I see," he replied, his voice even, with just a hint of measured disbelief. "Rest assured, our IT department is working on it," Wade continued. Too quickly, almost as if rehearsed. "These glitches happen occasionally. Purely technical, I assure you. Perhaps if you return in an hour, we'll have it resolved." An hour. Shaq knew that was a stalling tactic. His instincts told him this wasn't about a technical glitch. The withdrawal was routine, substantial but not unusual for his level of account. More importantly, this was his own bank. He had personally invested millions into First Capital Bank and had known every executive in its upper echelons, including Wade. There was no reason, no excuse for this delay. "I'll wait," he said again, standing up, his full height casting a subtle shadow across Wade's neatly pressed suit. Shaq's tone wasn't confrontational. It was patient, but that patience was laced with a firm, silent challenge. The bank manager gave a tight nod and stepped away, but his retreat lacked the confident assurance one would expect. Shaq noticed it, the slight hitch in Wade's step, the way he glanced over his shoulder as though expecting something or someone. Minutes turned to longer stretches of silence. Shaq stood by the broad windows of the lobby, arms crossed, watching the world outside move along, unaware. Behind him, the whispers among the staff grew faintly louder. A young teller passed by, her hands trembling slightly, as she fumbled with a stack of receipts. She glanced at Shaq, her eyes darting away just as quickly. Shaq's mind was sharp, reading the room as clearly as he could read a defensive lineup on the basketball court. Something was happening beneath the surface. It was too polished, too orchestrated to be a simple system error. A faint vibration from his phone broke his focus. He checked the screen. It was a message from Lana Cross, a mid-level operations analyst he'd known for years. The message was brief, almost cryptic. "Be careful, not a glitch, something deeper." Shaq felt a chill crawl down his spine, though his face betrayed none of it. He looked over toward Lana, who was stationed at a far desk, her posture rigid as she pretended to focus on her monitor. Their eyes met briefly, and in that flicker of contact, an entire conversation passed between them. Crossing back to his chair, Shaq settled in, exuding the calm composure of a man used to waiting, but also used to winning. He reflected on past moments, times when his sheer size and presence had been both a shield and a target. Being Big Shaq meant being noticed, yes, but it also meant being underestimated, his down-to-earth nature mistaken for passivity. In this moment, he recognized the same undertones, subtle coded barriers not of system errors, but of bias and sabotage. Travers was playing a role, but the script wasn't entirely his own. Someone higher up was pulling the strings, testing Shaq's resolve. The question wasn't just about his withdrawal, it was about control, about who held power in a room when quiet resistance was the only weapon allowed. Shaq's thoughts were interrupted when Wade returned, yet again, this time with a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "Mr. O'Neill," he began, his voice faltering just slightly. "I do apologize. We're still experiencing unexpected delays. We truly appreciate your patience. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in our executive lounge while we resolve this." Shaq's smile was thin, his gaze steady. "I'll stay here," he said simply. The moment stretched, a quiet standoff filled with unsaid words. Wade gave a curt nod and turned away. But this time Shaq noticed how he immediately whispered something to an assistant, a young man who disappeared swiftly into a back corridor. A minute later, another message buzzed on Shaq's phone. "Lana again. They're stalling you. There's a meeting happening right now. They're deciding what to do." The knot in Shaq's stomach tightened. His pulse remained steady, but his mind sharpened, moving swiftly through possible scenarios. Someone somewhere was trying to lock him out of his own assets, perhaps even attempting to make a statement. Whether it was corporate politics, personal vendettas, or something darker, he couldn't yet say, but he would not sit idly by. Suddenly, Shaq tapped a few quick commands on his phone, activating a secure line to his legal advisor, Ron Booker. His voice was low but firm, a whisper against the hum of the bank. "Ron, something's up. I'm being stalled. Find out who's behind this." Quietly, Ron's calm voice responded. "Got it. Hold tight." Shaq slid the phone back into his pocket, his movements smooth and deliberate. His thoughts turned briefly to his mother, Lucille, and her words of resilience echoing through his mind. "You don't need to shout to be heard, son. The quietest man in the room can hold the most power if he stands tall." He straightened, his presence radiating, an unspoken challenge. The staff's murmurings continued, their eyes occasionally darting toward him with a mix of curiosity and concern. The tension was palpable now, like a taut string waiting to snap. Shaq knew the next move would be his, and he intended to make it count. Whatever invisible hand was trying to pull the strings, they were about to learn that patience wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a calculated pause before a decisive, irreversible play. In the cool artificial light of the lobby, the stage was set, and Big Shaq was ready to rewrite the script. The atmosphere inside the bank had shifted from sterile professionalism to an uneasy quiet, thick with murmurs, just below the threshold of audible conversation. The floor tiles gleamed under the filtered light from the tall windows, but it was the glances, not the architecture, that spoke louder now. Shaq remained seated in his corner, back straight, eyes scanning the room as though measuring every movement with the precision of a chess player watching his opponent. The usual rhythm of the bank had been disrupted, and though most customers pretended not to notice, the tension whispered through every polite smile and calculated shuffle of paper. Near the teller stations, a few clients exchanged sidelong looks. One older gentleman in a sharp gray suit whispered something to the woman beside him, their eyes momentarily flicking toward Shaq. A young mother juggling her baby and phone shot a glance toward the VIP section where he sat, before looking quickly away. It wasn't fear or awe, more a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, as though they sensed something unusual was happening but were unsure what role, if any, they should play in it. Behind the counter, Lana Cross worked with measured efficiency. Her blonde hair was tied back, her posture impeccably straight, but her eyes darted subtly, scanning the room in quick intervals. She was known for her discretion and diligence, a professional who had kept her head down even in situations where speaking up might have invited trouble. But today, something in her careful composure gave way to tension. From her desk, Lana glanced toward Shaq. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that fleeting exchange, an entire message passed. She lowered her gaze, scribbled something quickly on a small notepad, and folded the paper into a tight square. Standing, she walked briskly toward the copier machine, feigning a task as she passed near Shaq's seat. As she moved by, she let the folded note slip from her hand, landing silently at his feet. Without breaking stride, she continued toward the copier, her face carefully composed. Shaq's broad hand moved with practiced grace as he retrieved the note, unfolding it beneath the shelter of his knee. The handwriting was tight, precise, betraying her urgency. "It's not a system issue. Something internal. You're being targeted. Be careful." A ripple of emotion, surprise, anger, and a hard edge of resolve moved through Shaq's chest. He folded the note, slipping it into his jacket pocket. His mind raced, piecing together the cues he'd been absorbing all morning. Wade Travers's polished but forced demeanor, The whispers, the glances, and now Lana's warning. Someone inside the bank was deliberately blocking his access. And it wasn't just about his withdrawal. It was bigger. He shifted slightly in his seat, allowing his gaze to move naturally across the room. In doing so, he caught snippets of conversation from nearby staff. Heard it came from upstairs. He's just sitting there, waiting. Never seen Travers this nervous before. The murmurs were fragmented, but the implications were clear. This wasn't just a technical glitch. It was a power play possibly directed at Shaq not just because of his wealth, but because of something more insidious. Something that whispered of control and exclusion. The weight of these realizations pressed down on Shaq. But his face remained calm, his breathing measured. He thought of his mother Lucille's words, spoken so many times when he was younger and uncertain. They can block a door, but they can't block your mind. Stay sharp, stay kind, and stay standing. Drawing on that quiet wisdom, Shaq leaned back in his chair, crossing one ankle over the opposite knee. He projected ease, but every nerve in his body was alert. He observed how Wade Travers avoided making eye contact, how certain employees exchanged worried glances, how even the security guards seemed a little too focused on their radios. Then a sudden subtlety, a hushed conversation between two junior staff near the coffee machine. Heard they flagged his account. Something about compliance issues, but no one's saying why. It's politics, you know. They can twist compliance any way they want if someone gives the order. Shaq's jaw tensed for just a moment, a muscle tightening near his temple. This was no ordinary compliance check. It was a targeted move, orchestrated with the plausible deniability of corporate bureaucracy. But why now? What message was being sent? His thoughts were interrupted by Lana, who returned to her station, but didn't look his way. Instead, she kept her eyes on her screen, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. He suspected she was digging deeper into the system, possibly trying to trace the decision-makers behind this blockade. Shaq felt a swell of gratitude for her quiet bravery. He knew Lana wasn't a risk-taker by nature. The fact that she'd taken this step meant the situation was worse than he had suspected. And if her note was right, that this wasn't just a technical issue, it meant he was being deliberately undermined, perhaps as a test of his patience, his resolve, or even his reputation. In that moment, the whispers around the lobby became part of a larger pattern. They weren't just idle gossip. They were the sound of people trying to make sense of power being wielded unfairly, of rules being bent to suit hidden agendas. They were the sound of complicity and caution, of employees unwilling or unable to challenge the system directly. Shaq's resolve hardened. He wouldn't confront Travers outright. Not yet. There was too much at stake, and too much he didn't yet know. But he wasn't going to sit idly by and let this slide, either. His silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. The next move needed to be precise, and when he made it, it would resonate far beyond the glass walls of this bank. He rose from his chair, adjusting his jacket with deliberate slowness. As he stood, the whispers hushed slightly, attention momentarily drawn to his imposing figure. Without a word, he walked toward the broad windows, looking out over the city bathed in sunlight. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a silent reminder of who he was, and who they were trying to challenge. The game had changed. The unseen hand was moving, but so was Big Shaq, and the next chapter was his to write. The denial hung in the air like an unfinished sentence, its weight palpable against the marble and glass of the bank's sleek architecture. Shaq remained still, his towering frame anchored to the leather chair, as though the sheer force of his presence might keep the growing unease at bay. The clock on the far wall ticked, each second dragging like a taut thread stretched closer to its breaking point. 9 minutes. That was how long he'd wait, not because he was patient, but because patience was a weapon sharpened by years of navigating spaces where he was both celebrated and subtly undermined. The first minute was filled with the echo of Wade Travers' retreating footsteps, that precise click of polished shoes on polished floors. Shaq's eyes followed Wade's disappearing figure, noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his phone as though seeking permission or deliverance. He wasn't just dealing with a system issue. No, this was the choreography of someone executing a plan, but not with full confidence. The second minute stretched longer. Shaq's mind traveled back to times when similar moments had unfolded. Meetings where his input was solicited, but dismissed. Boardrooms where his presence was welcomed but his voice subtly muted. He recalled the early days of his post-basketball ventures, when financial advisors smiled politely, while suggesting he simplify his investments, speaking to him in tones reserved for someone they assumed wouldn't grasp the complexities of business. But they were wrong then, just as they were wrong now. Shaq wasn't a man who forgot. By the third minute, he felt a faint pulse of tension between his temples. Not anger. No, that would be too simple. Too expected. It was something quieter, like a growing pressure. A quiet refusal to be dismissed. His thoughts turned to his mother, Lucille. He could almost hear her voice, warm and steady, reminding him of the strength found in stillness. "They'll try to rattle you," she'd said once when he was younger, after a game where he'd been benched without explanation. "But you stand tall, and you let them feel the weight of your presence. They can't ignore what doesn't waver." The fourth minute was when the whispers in the lobby seemed to grow louder, though no one dared raise their voice. Customers and staff alike stole glances in his direction, some with curiosity, others with faint traces of apprehension. He could sense their discomfort, the human instinct to distance oneself from conflict, even one so carefully concealed. But Shaq didn't move. He crossed one leg over the other, adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness, and let them watch. The fifth minute brought a subtle shift. Lana Cross, seated at her desk, tapped a series of rapid keystrokes, her brows knitting together in concentration. Though she didn't look up, Shaq knew she was working not just for the bank's operations, but for the truth. It was a silent alliance, one built on mutual respect and the understanding that some battles were fought in hushed tones and subtle gestures. Her loyalty, though quiet, was a beacon in this unfolding shadow play. By the sixth minute, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. Shaq's thoughts flicked briefly to the moment 9 minutes ago, when he'd first made his request. Back then it had seemed routine, a simple transaction. Now it felt like a performance, a test, a measure of how much he'd tolerate. But they'd underestimated him. They thought denial and delay would unnerve him, perhaps even prompt an outburst. But Shaq had long since mastered the art of control. His strength wasn't in loud words or rash actions. It was in the deliberate, calculated patience that unsettled those who mistook calm for weakness. The seventh minute brought the memory of a board meeting from 2 years ago. He'd sat at the head of a long table, listening as executives in tailored suits danced around uncomfortable truths. They'd spoken of market concerns and risk management, their words dripping with euphemisms that barely concealed their resistance to his proposals. When he'd pressed them politely but firmly, their discomfort had been palpable. They hadn't expected a man like Shaq, a man with a public persona of warmth and humor, to possess a mind as sharp as his. That meeting had ended with his vision approved, but not before he'd seen the flash of resentment in their eyes. The eighth minute arrived like a held breath. Lana glanced toward him, just once, a flicker of determination in her eyes, before she returned to her screen. Her silent message was clear. Something was moving behind the scenes. Shaq felt the subtle shift of momentum, as though an unseen curtain was beginning to lift. The players in this game were preparing their next move, but so was he. The ninth minute, the final tick of this silent countdown, was marked by a decision. Shaq rose from his seat, his movements unhurried, but definitive. His shadow stretched across the marble floor, elongating beneath the warm shafts of sunlight that streamed through the windows. The whispers grew faint, almost reverent, as the bank's lobby seemed to hold its collective breath. He wasn't just a client being denied access. He was a man taking control of the narrative, refusing to be boxed into silent acquiescence. He smoothed his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and turned slowly toward the exit, but his pace was not one of retreat. It was one of strategy. As he moved, he caught the faintest hint of a hushed conversation in the corridor near the manager's office. A voice low and urgent saying, "We need to figure out how to handle this before it escalates." Escalates. The word lingered in his mind as he stepped outside, the crisp sunlight kissing his face. The city's hum a counterpoint to the quiet storm brewing behind the bank's glass walls. They thought they could control the narrative with delays and polite denial. They thought they could outmaneuver a man whose power came not from arrogance but from resilience. But they were wrong. Shaq stood on the sidewalk, looking back at the building that had moments ago tried to dismiss him. His mother's words echoed softly in his mind. "Stand tall, son. Let them see that no amount of whispers can bring down a man who knows his worth." The 9 minutes were over. Now it was his turn to act. The tension in the bank thickened like an unseen fog as Shaq returned to his seat by the tall windows. Outside, the city hummed with its usual blend of urgency and routine. But inside, every glance felt weighted, every movement deliberate. He could feel the silent eyes on him, the curiosity of the customers, the caution of the staff, and the barely contained unease behind Wade Travers' polished facade. The denial of his withdrawal wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an orchestration, and Shaq was determined to uncover the real score. His phone buzzed once, a soft vibration against the leather of his seat. Lana Cross, ever discreet, had sent a brief message. "Check your left. Copy room." He lifted his gaze, naturally, catching the faintest movement near the corner of the lobby where a slim figure slipped out of the copy room. Her head down, her posture unremarkable. Lana. His pulse quickened, not with fear but with a readiness he hadn't felt in years. Without drawing attention, Shaq rose from his seat and moved toward the copy room. Each step was casual, measured, as though he were simply stretching his legs, but his mind was sharp, cataloging every detail. The furtive glances, the way the assistant manager's voice cracked in conversation nearby, the too quick shuffle of papers behind the reception desk. Something was unraveling. Inside the copy room, the air was cool and smelled faintly of toner. On the counter lay a sealed envelope, cream-colored with no markings. Shaq picked it up, feeling its weight, the subtle tension of the paper like a pulse in his hand. He slid it into his jacket pocket with the same ease he might have handled a basketball, and turned to leave, returning to his seat in the lobby before anyone could mark the exchange. Settled once more, he waited until the angle of his seat concealed him from most of the lobby before carefully opening the envelope. Inside were several sheets of paper, printed emails, transaction records, and internal memos. The more he read, the tighter his jaw clenched. His name, Shaquille O'Neal, appeared in the documents, but not in the ways he would expect. According to the records, an account under his name had been flagged for suspicious activity, transfers to and from shell corporations, balances inconsistent with his actual holdings. But it wasn't his account. The pattern was clear. Wade Travers, along with a circle of senior executives, had been laundering money through a network of fake accounts designed to look legitimate, but with no real backing. And in their haste, or perhaps their arrogance, they had looped in an account tied to Shaq's name, likely assuming that his status would keep it from scrutiny. When the system flagged it, they seized on the opportunity to deny his withdrawal, hoping the delay would cover their tracks long enough to erase the connection. His stomach churned, not with fear, but with a sharp, controlled anger. They had used his name, his reputation, his trust in the system he'd helped build. The betrayal was bitter, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't about him being seen as a rich man wanting his money. It was about silencing a powerful voice, masking corruption behind a veneer of protocol. He thought back to the long conversations with Lucille, his mother, about justice and perception. "Sometimes they'll try to turn your own strength against you," she'd said once. "They'll say you're too big, too loud, too much. But the truth has its own voice, and when you find it, you speak it." Shaq's mind raced through possibilities. If he confronted Wade now, the manager would deny everything, maybe even frame the evidence as a misunderstanding. The executives would close ranks, spinning the story into something plausible to outsiders. But Shaq wasn't an outsider. He was an insider who knew the system's seams and fractures. He could dismantle this quietly, strategically. He glanced around, noticing how Lana had resumed her duties as though nothing had happened. Her calm was a lifeline, a reminder that even within corrupt systems, there were people willing to do what was right, no matter the risk. Shaq made a mental note. When this was over, she wouldn't just be protected, she'd be recognized. His eyes returned to the papers, scanning for key names, dates, and sums. It wasn't just Wade. There were signatures from Victor Greer, a regional director with a reputation for keeping his hands clean, and Harrison Pike, the bank's compliance officer, whose digital signature had been used to approve transactions Shaq now knew were fraudulent. This web was bigger than he'd imagined. Sliding the papers back into the envelope, Shaq folded it carefully and tucked it deep into his jacket. His heartbeat steady, his thoughts sharp. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a challenge that required more than size or strength. This was a different game, one of leverage, precision, and timing. He could already feel the tide turning in his favor, the power shifting as the truth seeped through the cracks they'd tried to paper over. As he sat back, exuding an air of calm and control, he caught a glimpse of Wade, at the far end of the lobby, watching him with thinly veiled apprehension. The manager's expression flickered, worry, calculation, a faint hint of fear. He knew something had shifted, but he didn't yet know how far the shift would go. Shaq allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The stakes had risen, but so had his resolve. They thought they could use his name as a shield, a pawn in a game of deceit and greed. But they'd forgotten one thing. Big Shaq wasn't just a name. He was a force. And forces don't yield. They moved. He straightened his cuffs, smoothed the front of his jacket, and waited. The next move was his, and it would leave no room for doubt. The air outside the bank felt sharper, clearer, the hum of traffic and the rhythm of pedestrians filling the space that had been thick with tension moments ago. Shaq stepped out onto the wide sidewalk, his stride even, his shoulders squared, his expression composed. From a distance, one might have mistaken him for a man simply moving on from a routine errand. But those who looked closer, those who watched his slow, deliberate pace, would see the resolve threading through his every movement. He wasn't walking away in defeat. He was walking into position. The envelope sat securely in the inner pocket of his jacket, its contents pressing lightly against his chest like a silent declaration of truth. His phone was in his hand now, and with a few smooth swipes, he dialed a number burned into his memory. The call connected with a crisp click, and a familiar voice answered, low and steady. Shaq, talk to me. Ron, Shaq said, his voice quiet but charged with an undercurrent of certainty. They tried to pull a fast one at the bank. I've got proof in hand, internal memos, transactions, signatures. They're laundering money, and they used my name to cover it. I need you to look over these documents immediately. Ron Booker, an old friend and legal advisor who had guided Shaq through the labyrinth of contracts and corporate double talk for years, didn't waste time. Where are you now? Outside the bank. First Capital downtown. I'll send you photos of the papers. I want your eyes on every signature, every detail. Send them, Ron said without hesitation. I'll call you back in 10. Shaq ended the call and stepped to the side of the sidewalk, leaning lightly against a marble pillar. The city moved around him, indifferent to the quiet storm gathering beneath the surface. He used his phone to snap clear, precise photos of each page, sending them to Ron with a simple message: review everything, be discreet. As he hit send, his mind worked through the layers of the situation. Wade Travers wasn't acting alone. Of that he was certain. The documents pointed to a network of complicity, a scheme so carefully laid that it had taken months, maybe years to build. But it only took one mistake, linking the wrong name to the wrong account, for the cracks to start showing. They'd underestimated him, assuming his fame and easygoing nature would make him back down quietly. They didn't expect him to connect dots they thought were invisible. He replayed the morning in his head. The denial, the false politeness, the stolen glances among staff, Lana's quiet warning. The pattern had revealed itself like a watermark under scrutiny. Now he could see the strategy forming. He wasn't just going to confront them. He was going to dismantle their web piece by piece, exposing every thread they thought hidden. His phone vibrated. Ron's name flashed on the screen. He answered quickly. It's bad, Shaq, Ron said, his voice taut but controlled. These documents are legitimate. The signatures match known samples, and the transfers align with shell companies flagged by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They've been using your name as a smokescreen, and the paper trail leads directly to senior management. Shaq exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of years of trust and expectation. How deep do you think this goes? Deep enough, Ron replied. They're likely scrambling right now, trying to cover tracks. But this isn't sloppy. It's calculated. Someone at the top thought they were invincible. A thin smile played at the corner of Shaq's lips. Not one of triumph, but of realization. Let them scramble, he said, his voice low, a rumble of intent. I've got the evidence, and I've got time. Ron hesitated, then asked, what's your next move? Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly, as he looked back toward the bank's gleaming facade. I'm not going to make this a public scene yet. I'll give them space to think they've stalled me, but I want you to quietly prepare everything we need to hit them where it hurts. Compliance audits, media pressure, legal filings. I'll walk back in there soon, not as a client, but as the man with the weight of the law behind him. You've got it, Ron said. I'll get my team on it. Keep your cool. This isn't just about money. It's about setting the tone. Shaq ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. He took a moment to absorb the sounds of the city, the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt, the murmur of conversation, the distant wail of a siren. The ordinary world kept turning, unaware of the quiet battle lines being drawn in the heart of downtown. But Shaq felt it, the shift in momentum, the crackle of suspense tightening like a drawn bowstring. He glanced at his reflection in the bank's glass, seeing not just his own face, but the weight of the responsibility he carried. This wasn't just about clearing his name or retrieving his money. It was about standing against a system that thought it could manipulate and silence with quiet efficiency. They'd tried to write him out of his own story, but they'd forgotten one truth. Big Shaq didn't walk away. He stepped forward. With one last glance at the bank, Shaq turned and began walking down the sidewalk, his stride purposeful. The calm exterior remained, but underneath it surged a current of strategy and intent. His legal team was mobilizing. The evidence was secure, and the players in the shadow game were about to discover just how far he was willing to go. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the sky was darkening, and Big Shaq was ready. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, its brilliance casting sharp-edged shadows across the city. Noon arrived with an almost theatrical flourish, as if the universe itself sensed that the moment had come. Shaq returned to the front of First Capital Bank, his stride purposeful, his expression composed. Where earlier he had walked with the quiet patience of a man assessing the battlefield, now he moved with the silent authority of one who had already won. The glass doors parted for him, as though the building itself recognized the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the muted chatter of customers and the quiet movements of staff. But as Shaq entered, the energy shifted, conversations faltered, glances were exchanged, and the air became charged with a tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone noticed his return, and though no one spoke his name aloud, the weight of his presence was palpable. He moved across the marble floor toward the VIP reception area, where a startled assistant behind the desk stammered a greeting. "Mr. O'Neill, a welcome back. How may I assist you today?" Shaq's gaze was steady, his voice calm but carrying a resonance that silenced the space around him. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Travers. Here, now." The assistant's mouth opened to object, but the look in Shaq's eyes made it clear that argument would be futile. She nodded briskly and picked up the phone, her voice low and hurried as she conveyed the message. Moments later, Wade Travers appeared from a side office, his polished shoes gliding across the floor as though he were trying to project composure. But his face was tight, his smile strained, and a faint sheen of perspiration glistened at his hairline.
"Mr. O'Neill," Wade greeted, forcing a tone of professional pleasantness. "I didn't expect—"
Shaq raised a hand, cutting off the preamble without raising his voice. "I won't take much of your time, Wade, but I suggest you listen carefully. Everyone here should—" The surrounding staff froze. Customers glanced around, some craning their necks to see. The entire lobby seemed to lean in, held captive by the gravity of the moment. Shaq reached into his jacket and retrieved the now slightly worn envelope, its contents a loaded pistol of truth aimed not with violence, but with irrefutable evidence. He opened it with deliberate care and withdrew the documents, emails, transaction logs, internal memos. He held them up, his voice low and steady, each word carrying the weight of undeniable proof. "These papers outline an internal laundering scheme that has been running through this branch. Names, dates, figures, money being funneled through fake accounts, one of which was tied to my name, without my knowledge. This isn't a glitch, it's deliberate fraud." A ripple ran through the room. Murmurs, gasps, the sharp intake of breath from a teller who dropped a pen onto the counter. Wade's face drained of color, his lips parting as though to mount a defense. But Shaq continued, his tone as unyielding as steel wrapped in velvet. "I know you thought you could use my name, my reputation as a shield for your own schemes. You assumed my status would make me cautious, unwilling to raise the alarm. But you were wrong. I've already secured legal validation of these documents, and I've briefed my legal team. This evidence has been prepared for submission to both federal authorities and the press." The whispers surged into a hushed chorus of disbelief and tension. The entire lobby seemed suspended in time, the air itself thick with shock. Wade's hands trembled slightly, his carefully constructed mask of composure cracking with every word. Shaq stepped forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Wade. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to posture. The evidence and the truth spoke louder than any threat could. "Effective immediately, Wade Travers, you are terminated from your position as branch manager of First Capital Bank. The grounds for this termination are fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and willful misconduct. My legal team has already prepared the necessary documentation to make this official. You will have the opportunity to defend yourself if you can." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rustle of papers, as Shaq handed the documents to a stunned senior staff member nearby. The woman's hands shook as she accepted them, her expression a mixture of shock and relief, as though she had been waiting for someone to shatter the illusion that had bound them all. Wade opened his mouth again, but the words died on his tongue. His shoulders sagged, his gaze darting around the room for support, but found none, even the security guards at the entrance, who had earlier greeted Shaq with casual respect, now stood straighter, their expressions unreadable but resolute. Shaq turned slightly, addressing the room with the quiet authority of a man, reclaiming not just his name, but the integrity of the institution. This isn't about me, it's about ensuring this place stands for something real. Trust is earned, not stolen. I won't let corruption hide behind polite smiles and corporate excuses. His words settled over the room like a blanket of truth. And for a moment, the bank was utterly still. Then Lana Cross, her face pale but determined, stepped from behind her desk. She stood tall, her voice clear but edged with emotion. I'll oversee the transition while this gets handled properly. We'll make sure the bank runs clean. Shaq nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage, her refusal to be complicit in silence. He turned back to Wade, whose face was now ashen, his hands trembling. Leave, Shaq said, his tone final, his voice soft but carrying the weight of finality. Now, Wade hesitated for a heartbeat, but something in Shaq's eyes made him realize the futility of resistance. Shoulders slumping, he turned and walked toward the exit, the once proud manager reduced to a figure of disgrace. The doors hissed open, and he vanished into the blinding sunlight outside. Shaq watched him go, then turned to the staff and customers who still stood frozen, caught in the quiet aftermath. Thank you for your patience, he said, his voice now carrying a note of reassurance. Business will continue as usual, but with integrity restored. The tension began to ease, the whispers fading into silence as people began to breathe again. Shaq straightened his jacket, the burden of the past few hours falling away like an old weight. He had made his move, decisive, controlled and unshakable, and now the story was his to finish. By late afternoon, the buzz had grown louder than the marble floors could contain. What began as murmurs in a single bank branch had become a ripple tearing through the city's business circles. Shaquille O'Neal, the beloved giant, the community figure, the self-made CEO, had done something few expected. He didn't just demand justice, he delivered it in real time, calmly, without spectacle, and now the streets were talking. Outside the bank, clusters of bystanders had begun to gather. Some had heard fragments of the confrontation through word of mouth. Others caught whiffs of it online, as someone from inside, an intern or maybe a client, had posted a vague tweet about Shaq terminating a corrupt bank manager, like it was a boardroom thriller. It spread fast. By the time the sun began casting longer shadows across the sidewalk, news vans had started circling. A local news outlet ran a teaser headline on its site. Shaq exposes internal fraud at First Capital. Details unfolding. Inside, the mood had transformed from tension to quiet awe. Customers looked around as if reappraising the building they once feared was just another fortress of polished deceit. Employees whispered in clusters, eyes drawn repeatedly to Lana Cross, who now moved through the floor not with hesitation but with a silent fire of responsibility. She wasn't hiding behind her desk anymore. She had become the point of contact, the quiet pivot around which the staff began to reorganize. Shaq stood in a corner office now temporarily assigned to him, not as a banker, but as the man cleaning house. He watched the lobby through the glass, arms folded, his expression unreadable. In one hand he held his phone, text after text arriving from friends, public figures and reporters. Most offered support, some wanted to spin the story. A few, more disturbingly, came from unknown numbers with vague warnings about digging too deep. He ignored them all for now. Lana knocked once and entered. Her voice was calm, steady, but her eyes still held disbelief at the chain of events. We've got news requests coming in. Channel 7 wants an exclusive. Business Weekly too. They're asking for statements, confirmation mostly. Shaq didn't look away from the lobby. Let him wait. Right now, I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to restructure trust. Lana nodded. People are talking, you know, about you, about what just happened. They should be talking about why it happened, Shaq said quietly. Lana approached the desk and placed down a folder thicker than the last. While you were speaking with Travers, I kept digging. And I found something you need to see. Shaq opened the folder. Inside were emails, flagged memos, and financial records she'd quietly pulled while pretending to do routine account reviews. Her findings went beyond what two other names stood out: Harrison Pike, already mentioned in the laundering records, and now Marjorie Vicks, an executive from the regional board. Vicks's signature appeared on several of the internal approvals. The dates lined up. The scheme wasn't just confined to the branch. It was systemic. They knew, Lana said. This wasn't a local operation. They're using selected accounts with big names as shields. Your profile gave them just enough legitimacy to run massive transfers through shell accounts without raising eyebrows. You weren't their only cover, but you were the boldest. Shaq's silence deepened. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he picked up the folder and flipped it shut. They've built something rotten, he murmured, and they were counting on no one having the guts to tear it open. He looked back at Lana. You just became more than an analyst. Her eyes widened slightly. I didn't do this for a promotion. I know, Shaq replied. That's why it mattered. Meanwhile, outside the glass doors, customers who had watched him walk in that morning now stopped to nod as they passed. A local cafe owner crossed the street just to say thank you. A retired couple who had banked there for 30 years walked in to move their accounts, citing Shaq as the only reason they still trusted the institution. The building was still standing, but the energy inside had changed. It wasn't fear or confusion anymore. It was momentum. But the danger hadn't passed. Ron Booker's earlier message flashed in Shaq's mind. The real players, regional board, maybe corporate, they won't like what's coming. You hit one corner of their empire. They'll either try to absorb you or erase the trail. Be ready. Shaq was ready. He turned back to Lana. I want every file you've got backed up twice. One copy goes to Ron. The other stays with me. We're not just cleaning house. We're preparing for a storm. She nodded. Already done. And there's more. Someone slipped this under the mailroom door. She handed him a single sheet of paper, handwritten unsigned. Just one line. Wade was a pawn. Vicks isn't the last name you'll find. Shaq stared at the note, his jaw tightening. Somewhere, someone else knew more. Someone still inside the system, trying to send a warning. It wasn't just about dirty money. It was about deeper rot, the kind that could infect an entire institution if left unchecked. He folded the note, placed it in his jacket, and turned back toward the lobby. A security guard met his gaze and gave a short, respectful nod. Staff were standing straighter now, no longer moving, as though under watch, but as though they had been given back a sense of purpose. Shaq exhaled, slow and steady. He wasn't done. Not even close. This wasn't just a branch problem. It was the tip of something larger. And as much as the crowd outside saw him as a hero, he knew better. He wasn't the story's end. He was its ignition. The fallout had begun, and with it, the first cracks in something far bigger than they'd imagined. The evening air settled over the city like a heavy cloak, the late sun casting long shadows that stretched across the streets and buildings. Inside his private office, far from the glass and marble world of the bank, Shaq sat with his elbows propped on his desk, his phone placed precisely in front of him. The light on the device blinked softly, signaling a missed call that had come through minutes ago. No number, no caller ID, just a single voicemail waiting, heavy with implication. He drew a slow breath, his mind already turning over possibilities. He tapped the screen, placed the phone on speaker, and listened. The message crackled softly through the speaker. The voice distorted, masked or perhaps filtered through a low-quality line, but its words were clear enough to slice through the static. Mr. O'Neill, the voice began, low and deliberate, each word spaced with care. You've only scratched the surface. Wade was a distraction, a pawn meant to keep eyes away from the real players. Look higher. The regional board has been orchestrating these schemes for years, targeting accounts connected to minority-owned businesses. Yours wasn't the first. It won't be the last unless someone takes it apart from the inside. Be careful. They don't lose quietly. The message ended, leaving only the faint hum of background noise before the line disconnected. Shaq stared at the phone, the weight of the revelation settling into his chest. His pulse beat harder, not from fear but from a surge of anger laced with determination. His withdrawal denial, the planted transactions, Wade's bumbling arrogance. It was all part of something deeper, more insidious. This wasn't just about one corrupt manager padding his pockets. This was systemic. He rose from his chair and paced the room, the message echoing in his thoughts. Wade's guilt was undeniable, but now Shaq understood the bigger game. The laundering operation had been carefully designed to exploit trust, shielded by layers of corporate hierarchy and policies that allowed those at the top to remain untouchable. The use of accounts tied to high-profile figures like him wasn't just opportunistic, it was strategic, a calculated risk to ensure plausible deniability. And the victims weren't limited to him. Minority-owned businesses, already fighting for their place in an uneven economic playing field, were being targeted and used as pawns in a game rigged against them. The implications churned in his mind, connecting dots that had lingered just out of sight. He thought back to community meetings, where small business owners had shared stories of inexplicable account freezes, surprise audits, or sudden loan denials. He'd dismissed them as unfortunate incidents, isolated cases. Now he saw the pattern. The same methods used against him scaled down to suffocate those with less voice, less leverage. His phone buzzed again, this time a direct call from Ron Booker. Shaq answered immediately. "Ron, we've got a bigger problem." Ron's voice was steady, but urgent. "I saw the voicemail too. I ran a quick trace. Not much, but the source seems to be a burner routed through multiple towers. Someone inside, maybe. But it's solid. I checked public records and internal filings. There's a pattern. Minority-owned businesses flagged for compliance reviews right before large sums disappear from their accounts. The same executive signatures show up. It's bigger than just the branch." Shaq's jaw tightened. "How long have they been running this?" "Years. Maybe longer," Ron said. "But it's well hidden. The documentation's designed to look routine. Any one piece by itself doesn't scream corruption. But put them together? It's a deliberate strategy to siphon funds from businesses least able to fight back." The realization struck like a gut punch. This wasn't just about Shaq's money. It wasn't about his pride or reputation. It was about every small business owner whose accounts had been quietly drained. Every entrepreneur denied a loan under suspicious circumstances. Every family-run operation forced to shutter because the system had rigged the rules. This was personal. It always had been. He exhaled slowly, the anger in his chest cooling into something sharper, colder, a focus that went beyond instinct. "Ron, I want everything compiled. I want names, dates, amounts. I want a timeline that traces this all the way to the top. We're not just dealing with Wade Travers, we're dealing with an organized machine." Ron's voice was firm. "Understood. I've already got a team working through the data. But Shaq, you need to be careful. This isn't just fraud. It's systemic corruption tied to people with real power. If we push too fast, too loud, they'll bury it or worse." "I know," Shaq said quietly. "But if we don't push, they'll keep doing it. They've been doing it to people who didn't have the means to fight back. That ends now." He returned to his desk, sat and tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the polished wood. The lines were drawn more clearly now. Wade was just a pawn discarded as soon as his usefulness ended. The real players were higher, insulated by layers of bureaucracy and wealth, and they weren't going to fold easily. But that didn't mean Shaq was backing down. It meant he was shifting gear. In the reflection of his office window, he saw the skyline etched against the setting sun, and with it a reminder of every small business he'd supported, every young entrepreneur he'd mentored. His fight wasn't just for himself, it was for all of them, for the ones who didn't have a legal team on speed dial, for the ones who couldn't confront corruption with evidence and witnesses. He picked up the phone again. "Ron, call the media outlets. The ones who'll dig. Tell them there's a bigger story brewing, and I'll have details for them soon." Quietly. "For now." "Got it," Ron said. "I'll move carefully." Shaq ended the call and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if drawing strength from the silence. They thought he'd be satisfied with removing one corrupt player from the board. They thought he'd see the surface and walk away. But they were wrong. Shaq was just getting started. The first hint that something was shifting came not from within the bank's gleaming walls, but from the headlines plastered across the city by morning. "Shaquille O'Neal exposes financial corruption," read one banner, while another declared, "Big Shaq brings corporate giants to their knees." The media had caught wind of the deeper story, thanks to Ron's strategic leaks, and the public response was immediate. Social media exploded with commentary, praise, and most importantly, scrutiny. It wasn't just about a celebrity's bank account anymore. It was about a system exposed for targeting the vulnerable. Inside First Capital Bank, the lobby, once stiff with apprehension and concealed whispers, now hummed with a different energy. Staff who had avoided eye contact before now greeted Shaq with respect that was no longer tinged with unease. Customers stepped forward not just to conduct business, but to thank him, some shaking his hand, others offering quiet words of gratitude. Local business owners, many of whom had endured similar silent betrayals, found their courage bolstered by his example. Shaq stood in the heart of the lobby, flanked by Lana Cross and Ron Booker, both armed with binders filled with documentation. Every thread of corruption traced and catalogued. Today wasn't about a confrontation. It was about closure, exposure, and setting a precedent. A conference room had been prepared on the upper floor, hastily converted into a press space, as cameras and reporters arrived. Shaq didn't wait for the introductions. He stepped forward, his voice calm, his presence undeniable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this isn't just about one man, or one account. It's about a system designed to take advantage of those least equipped to fight back. Over the past weeks, we've uncovered evidence that First Capital's regional board orchestrated financial misconduct that targeted minority-owned businesses, creating obstacles and injustices hidden behind bureaucracy and legalese. They thought they could silence us with complexity, but the truth has a way of finding light." He held up a folder marked with legal insignias. These documents contain every detailed transactions, emails, memos that expose this scheme. The evidence has been submitted to federal authorities. Independent auditors have been engaged. Compliance teams have been called in from outside the bank's current structure, and those responsible have been named. The reporters' pens flew across notepads, cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. But Shaq's tone remained measured, his message clear. "I'm not here to destroy a bank. I'm here to rebuild it, to show that integrity can be restored. This institution was once a symbol of trust in our community. It will be again, not because of wealth or reputation, but because it will be built on principles of fairness and equality." Lena stepped forward then, her voice steady. "Effective today, I've been appointed as acting branch manager. We will implement immediate reforms to our compliance systems, focusing on transparency and accountability. Every customer, every client, will be treated with respect and fairness." "That's not a slogan. That's a promise." Shaq nodded toward her, pride unmistakable in his eyes. He had seen her strength, her quiet courage, and he knew she would lead with the same unyielding integrity he valued. She wasn't a token promotion. She was the embodiment of what the bank and the community needed to heal. As the press conference concluded, reporters pressed for statements from the executives named in the evidence. Some had already resigned, their public relations teams scrambling to control the narrative. Others were silent, knowing the weight of legal consequences was now unavoidable. But in the eyes of the public, the message was clear. Accountability wasn't optional. Outside the bank, the city buzzed with stories of Shaq's stand. Local news stations aired interviews with business owners sharing their own stories of inexplicable account closures and loan denials. Some spoke through tears of frustration finally acknowledged, others with cautious hope. The narrative had shifted, no longer confined to boardrooms, but alive in the streets, in community centers, in homes where parents taught their children about resilience and justice. Back inside, Shaq returned to the familiar leather chair in his temporary office. He leaned back, his gaze thoughtful as he watched Lana coordinate her team, and Ron field calls from legal contacts and auditors. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to reflect not on the battle itself, but on the path that had led him here. He thought of Lucille, her voice steady in his mind. "You don't need to shout to be heard. But when you speak, speak with purpose." He thought of the countless times he'd witnessed injustice slip by in silence, not because people didn't care, but because they believed they couldn't win against systems too big to challenge. But today he had shown that even the quietest resistance, when backed by truth and strategy, could shift the balance. He stood, smoothing his jacket, and stepped back into the lobby. Staff members looked up, pausing in their work. Customers turned toward him, some smiling, others nodding with unspoken gratitude. He spoke then, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's a beginning, a commitment to stand against what's wrong, to fight for what's fair, and to remember that when we stand together, no one, not a boardroom, not a policy, can silence that truth." The applause that followed wasn't raucous, but it was heartfelt, a quiet affirmation that resonated far beyond the polished walls. It was a promise, not just from Shaq, but from everyone who had witnessed the shift, who had felt the tremor of change ripple through the air. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light through the tall windows, Shaq allowed himself a small smile. The battle had been fought without a single act of violence, without grandiose gestures, just truth, courage, and the refusal to accept silence as an answer. He walked to the glass doors, stepping outside as the city bathed in evening light. Behind him, the bank stood taller, not because of its architecture, but because of what it now represented. Not just a financial institution, but a symbol of what could be reclaimed when one man refused to be shaken, when truth was armed not with aggression, but with resolve. In his mind, Lucille's voice echoed softly, a final reminder: legacy isn't what you leave for yourself, it's what you leave for others to stand on. And as Shaq gazed out over the city, he knew the legacy of the unshaken was just beginning. If this story made you think, if it made you feel that quiet strength can change the game, then keep the conversation alive. Share your thoughts, challenge what you see around you, and stand tall for what's right. Stay curious, stay sharp, and stay connected with stories that inspire.